It goes without saying that it's been an excruciatingly difficult year. It's been an excruciatingly difficult year in many ways, and many of us have probably experienced conversations or the lack of conversations as anything but rewarding. And one thing that is always true about my work, but I don't always feel as much of an acute need to say it at the beginning as I do now, is that I don't do this work because I think it's always good to talk, because I think we always need to talk, because I think that talk is always the solution. It's not. And some of that reason is because it might not be for us as people right now, as individuals, I mean. Some of that is because the historical moment is not ready for it. Some of it is some kind of combination of personal, historical, political factors. It's not always the right moment. And so I started doing this research 10 years ago because I was curious about what happens when people try to talk across political divides. I didn't start doing the research because I had decided that it was right for people to try to talk about political divides. I don't do research on things that I think I already know. That would be boring and, a terrible waste of time. So I do this research because I am still curious about what happens when people try to have these conversations, what good and what harm can come out of it for whom and when and why. And that's why I've opened these questions in the work that I do. But it's never a pronouncement about what people should do. It's really a curiosity about what happens when people do. So I just wanted to start out with that. So what I'm going to be doing today is running through a quick summary of research I've been doing on dialogue across political divides. I'll then talk a little bit about what I think these conversations can mean for this current moment in our democracy, and the implications for teaching controversial issues as well as for navigating conversations about them in our lives. I've been doing this research in a variety of settings. I started 10 years ago focusing on public forums between police and community members. I then looked at public discussions in Charlottesville following the Unite the Right rally. And then since 2017, have been focusing primarily on public forums on college campuses. So structured conversations that bring together politically opposed college students. And I started doing this research because it became clear that whether and how we should talk to people we disagree with about politics had itself become a contentious political issue, that we're not only divided on the substantive issues, but also on whether and how we should interact with people who we disagree with on those substantive issues. That for some people, it's civil discourse that will save our democracy, and for others, it is actually a tool that is driving oppression, that it's deepening the problems that are threatening democracy to begin with. And you see these fears across the political spectrum, although the content of the fears is different, particularly when it comes to having these conversations in schools and colleges. So on the political right, you have this fear of liberal brainwashing, that if we have conversations about politics in schools and universities, it's going to lead to some kind of massive conversion of all students into left-wing liberals, such as through the 1619 Project or what's thought of as critical race theory. And on the left, fears that if you talk about politics in schools, that you could end up with this kind of narrow, exclusive, jingoistic narrative about American national identity, right? So that essentially, either way, if you let explicit discussion about politics into the classroom, students are going to end up brainwashed, essentially. And there are particular fears about what happens when you engage students in deliberation. So not just textbook coverage of American politics that are contentious, but active deliberation about these issues, and particular fears on the left about what happens in deliberation. So One, students from more dominant groups who possess markers of status, who can speak in a certain way with a certain kind of vocabulary and cadence, will end up sounding more rational, even though they're not. And also that students from majority groups will seem more rational because their experiences reflect the common sense of many Americans. Like, oh, that makes sense because it aligns with my experience, therefore it must be more rational, you must be right. Whereas students who have had experiences that are not shared by people in the majority group might come across as irrational because their experiences haven't been shared. So they don't make tacit sense, right? So this is a fear about what could happen in deliberation. And as a result, students from minoritized groups who participate in these conversations could end up feeling like they have been, as one of my students who I interviewed put it, heard but not listened to, right? That their voices will technically have been included, but no one will have listened, right? And so it will actually be exploitative. And that these conversations can be used to justify the status quo by seeming to create a democratic process when no new ideas are actually going to be at play, received. So this is a key fear about what happens when you ask students to deliberate. And finally, a fear is that if you deliberate about key issues of justice, what should be very clear lines of right and wrong can become blurry, right? So just as an obvious example to make this really visceral, nobody wants a deliberation for young students about whether slavery is justified, right? That's a settled issue. But what else we include in that category as beyond the pale of deliberation can often be very unsettled. And so there's a fear that too much will be included in the category of what students are encouraged to deliberate about, and therefore blur lines that should actually be clear for students, made clear for students about right and wrong, just and unjust. So it was against this backdrop of fears and worries and hopes about deliberation that I started doing this research. And today I'm going to be focusing on my research on college campuses, because that's where we are, and ask what happens when students try to talk to each other across political divides, and with what significance for students personally and for democracy. So I observed dialogues between politically opposed students that were happening across the American Southeast and Northeast. These were structured conversations where students were brought together for usually about 2 hours, intentionally seated around tables with peers who they had, according to the online poll they filled out in advance, disagreed with about politics. And then the conversations were structured to generate not debate, but dialogic understanding. So questions such as, how are politics spoken about in the home in which you were raised? To begin with personal narratives, scaffolded to, what issue do you care about most in the previous or upcoming election and why? Scaffold to, what do you least or most understand about the other side? So building on personal to broader political experiences and views in an effort to cultivate understanding between students. The question I wanted to know is, what good does it do, if any? You get students in a room, you ask them to try to understand people who disagree with them deeply about the political issues about which they're most divided. What happens? And what became very clear, almost ubiquitously, is that students really don't change their mind as a result of these conversations when it comes to their views on political issues. But many of them shift pretty dramatically in their feelings about the people they disagree with. that this is a process that shifts feelings about outgroup partisans, you could say, more than it changes the content of political views. And it does so in three ways. One, it personalizes, and this is basically a combination of humanization and individualization. So you see not just that this is a human, but a particular human, a very specific human who maybe has a mother who reminds you of your mother, and you have a similar relationship to her, and who has a really good sense of humor. Second, and this personalization is pretty ubiquitous. Students walk away with this. Second, is you see that often the other person means well. The person that you thought was either stupid or crazy or just bad actually has intentions that you can recognize as good. And the third is, and this was the least common but the most robust, the capacity to recognize that there was validity in the other's ethical standpoint, even when you did not adopt it as your own. That you could recognize validity to it without endorsing it. And this was the least common but the most robust form of this legitimation of other people. Now, the good thing is that dialogue is not some kind of manipulation machine that just convinces you that everybody means well and is a good person and has legitimate ideas. It doesn't actually brainwash you. It offers you an opportunity to find out. So students did not all walk away thinking that person has a valid ethical standpoint that I can recognize as legitimate, even as I don't affirm it. It actually helps students become clearer, as I'll talk about it in a moment, about what they do think is a legitimate basis for politics. But it wasn't some kind of manipulative machine. It gave them the chance to find out that people that maybe they assumed had no basis could have something that they could recognize as valid. And in this, what was crucial was the recognition of moral disagreement. So often in these conversations, we try to rush to consensus and figure out what we share. And that's good. It's good to figure out what we share. There's a reason humans try to connect intuitively in this way. That's not bad, it's good. But the danger, and you could probably guess, imagine this, the danger is that when we only stay with what we have in common, but we know that we vote differently, or we know that we judge this issue differently, we can walk away thinking, well, I don't know how that person got from this shared value to that crazy view. So that person must either not be very well informed, or must just not be a very coherent thinker, or must be self-interested, acting in bad faith. So it was when students were able to dig into the nature, the deeper nature of the disagreement, that they were best able to recognize that there could be validity, ethical validity to a view that differed from their own. And again, not all the time, not with every issue. Dialogue is a mechanism through which to find out. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by these terms, an example of personalization. So one student said, it changes how I view the opposing side. It puts a face to it. It gives me someone I know. An example of the recognition of ethical motivation. So a student says, and these are students who I interviewed in the weeks after they participated in one of these dialogues. The student said, at times when I read the 3 people in my news feed that are super pro-Trump, I'm livid. I'm so mad at these people, so disgusted by these people. It's very easy for me to write on Facebook, any idiot who supports this immigration ban is a total idiot, or something like that kind of icky crap that you read on Facebook. What I really liked about this dialogue is I sat with these 4 innocent little Christian kids, and I realized they weren't very engaged with the stuff we were trying to figure out. They certainly weren't monsters. They certainly didn't deserve to be called fascists or assholes or idiots or Nazis or whatever. I do think that empathy is huge. I find myself defending the other side a little bit differently. Like now when I'm in my real world, These kids were all abortion. That's literally the only thing they talked about. I said, look, regardless of what we think about the immigration ban, we have to acknowledge that there are single issue voters. And for those people, if they legitimately think that Hillary, so this was after the 2017 election, obviously, it's nice when I talk about this with the undergraduates, they're like, you mean 100 years ago? But you're like, it's not 100 years ago. If they legitimately think that Hillary was a baby killer, if that's the case, we can't really assume that they support everything Trump's doing or did. That was the good part of the dialogue. I think it was just that empathy. So you can see that he has not increased his respect of the people he disagrees with. He refers to them as kids, little. He thinks that they're uninformed. What has changed is his apprehension of their intentions. They're not assholes or idiots or Nazis or fascists, right? They're well-meaning. And then third, this more robust form that's more difficult, seeing that there's validity to another's ethics. I asked a student, who did you learn the most from at the dialogue? And he said, probably the girl I mentioned who responded with the reasons why she voted for Clinton and why she was with the party she was with. I learned a lot from her. I'm a little ashamed to realize that my presuppositions were that liberals are supporting their ideas from a position of hate or social control. Obviously, I'm sure that there's people at all levels that maybe do think that way, but on the ground, I would imagine there's more people than I expected who are thinking positively and really have high ideals and aspirations. So he can recognize the aspirations as high, as ideals, rather than as misinformation. So I then followed up with many of these students again in 2020, in the weeks before the 2020 election. So I interviewed them in October of 2020. And what I found first was that this shifted relationship to the person was what lasted over time. So many of the students did not even remember what they talked about in the dialogue because it had happened 3 years before. They didn't remember the issue sometimes that they had discussed. They were like, maybe it was refugees or education. I don't know. It was 100 years ago. Exactly. And so what they remembered was the person. So they said things like, I remember the guy I talked to was a really decent guy who asked really sincere questions. So they remembered the person, and that this had stayed with them for some of them at crucial moments of national division. So for example, there was a conservative student who I spoke with who had voted Republican in each election that he had voted in and was a devout Catholic and pro-life. And I asked him, have you thought about the dialogue since it happened? If so, when? What made you think of it? What did you think? And he said, yeah, during the Supreme Court hearings for Justice Barrett, for Amy Coney Barrett, I thought about the guy I talked to who was pro-choice. And I was like, oh, what did you think about? And he said, I just remembered that he asked really good questions, and I wondered what he's thinking about all of this. So it puts, as one student said, it puts a face to it, and it generates curiosity about how another person might see a shared national moment rather than only stoking the worst assumptions about each other. I also found that for a small number of students, the learning deepened over time and moved from seeing that someone meant well to seeing that they might actually have validity to their reasoning. And this was true for a very small number of students who had continued to reflect on it. So for example, you remember the student who said these 4 little innocent Christian kids who weren't very well informed. When I interviewed him again 3 years later, he said, I asked him, have you been thinking about it since then? What have you been thinking about? And he said, it definitely struck me at that point. People really think abortion is murder, period. And because of that, we say pro-choice, 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 pro-choice. It's a woman's body. That makes sense to me. I'm guessing that makes sense to you. But to somebody who believes it's murder, that's a big deal. And so then I say, okay, what if the Democrats decided that it's okay to throw an actual baby in a dumpster because the mom doesn't want it or because the mom can't afford it? Would I change my vote? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? The Democrats are still right. They're still correct, in my opinion, on every other topic. So would I be cool with us throwing babies in dumpsters? I don't know. And I definitely have extreme empathy for people who all other arguments make sense to them on the Democrat side. So what I want to draw out of this quote, he's starting to understand the logic of being a single issue voter, even though he does not consider himself one himself. So he's saying, I thought those 4 little innocent Christian kids were not very smart or not very well informed to be making an election decision based only on abortion, based only on their pro-life views. But wait a minute. If I really thought abortion was murder, could I make that choice too? With all of my intelligence and reasoning capacity? Maybe I would. I don't know. So he has not shifted the content of his views or the way that he votes or his commitments, but what he's becoming more capacious in is his ability to imagine a different way of evaluating a situation. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, very, very few students changed their political views, none of them as a result of the conversation. When I interviewed students again in October of 2020, a small number had changed their political views. Some of them had even changed their political party, but not because they were argued out of their views. What had happened for those students is they had had powerful life experiences after the conversation that shifted something in their relationship to politics, and then in retrospect saw the conversation as having been the first time they were exposed to a different way of understanding something, and then started to draw on it in retrospect to interpret their new feelings about politics. Some of those students saw themselves as having begun to recognize this in the conversation, again, not because they were argued out of their views, like somebody gave them facts that they just couldn't dispute and now they're changing their political party. Not that. Rather, they began to feel like what somebody was describing was a truer description of what they already believed. And this is the way that Charles Taylor, the philosopher, talks about what reasoning actually is. So Taylor says, the task of reasoning is not to disprove some radically opposed first premise, like killing people is no problem, but rather to show how the policy is unconscionable on premises which both sides accept and cannot but accept. So for the students who in the conversation started to think about shifting their political identities, it was because what their conversation partners said was appealing to the way they already understood their values and was inviting them to think of it as another expression and a better expression of what they already felt they affirmed. So for example, when I interviewed Bianca again in 2020, 3 years later, I asked her, did the dialogue change your views on politics in any way or change anything for you? And she said, I think it did, because for once I had to really have a stand, because everyone was saying, I'm for this and I'm against this, and they were able to say it so plainly. And I had never really done that. So I think it helped me realize I don't think I'm Republican in any way. I think I'm more left-leaning. So I think I did realize that. And it was the first time I had really expressed my views on abortion in front of the other Christian students. And I was like, I do not know how they're going to take this or what they're going to think of me, but I still stand by my reasoning for why I said that. So yeah, I think it just kind of gave me a foundation to work on. I guess it was like the first step in revealing who I am or forming my own identity. I'm finally owning up my own views. Some people are like, where's this coming from? But I feel like it's always been in my mind. I just didn't have the words for it almost, and now I finally do. So not argued out of her position, able to recognize what she already believed in the words of someone else that she wanted to adopt as her own. One of the key ingredients in students who began to become more deeply reflective about their own political views was when they perceived the person they were talking with as asking them sincere questions that were motivated by curiosity so that they didn't feel that they needed to defend themselves. And when students did not feel that they needed to defend themselves or some group that they were perceived to be part of, that's when they were able to drop their defenses and ask themselves the question. That's when they were able to begin a process of asking themselves questions, when they didn't feel that they were being attacked. So for example, in 2020, I asked a student, have you thought about that dialogue since it happened? And she said, yes, the one at Penn. I've been thinking about that one the most because I remember the conversations we had at my table and how that was really the first time someone directly questioned me, like, why are you going to vote the way you are if you say you believe this or if you say you believe that? And it wasn't an attacking question. It was just that I was kind of taken aback because I had to really think about my answer and think, yeah, why am I voting the way I am? And getting to ask the same question of, okay, well, why do you believe in this? Why do you agree with that? Getting to directly ask questions of someone who's voting in a different way. And at the end of the night, being able to say thank you and not, well, your opinion's wrong, so I'm just not going to listen. So she's saying it wasn't an attacking question. So I've been able, and then she says, I do think about that conversation specifically a lot. And just that question of, if you believe this, why are you voting the way you are? Even though that's a very general question, thinking, okay, if I believe in rights for those seeking asylum, why am I going to vote either way for Biden or Trump? So she says, I've been asking myself that question. It's become a tool of her own self-reflection. And then for the students who actually went on and changed their political identities, like changed the party that they're registered for, it was really because they went off and had a powerful life experience that changed the way they feel about a key issue. And then again, in retrospect, saw the dialogue as having planted the seeds, but the conversation did not independently change their mind. So I want to return now to the worries that we started this talk with, the fears about what will happen if political conversation enters classrooms. One of the fears was that important lines of right and wrong would become blurred. And in these kinds of conversations that were really structured for curiosity, that didn't happen. That students, for the most part, became more deeply reflective, did not end up feeling paralyzed about what to do. Like, my fear was, well, are students going to get so reflective that they now feel like they can't engage in democracy because, it's just all too gray? But that actually didn't happen. In their deepened reflection, students actually became more committed to their positions. They were able to hear other ideas and realize more deeply what they had thought. And those small number of students who have been quoting, who did shift, did so not because they were, argued out of their position, but because over years they started asking themselves questions and becoming more deeply reflective. So this question of whether students from minoritized or underrepresented groups feel exploited in these conversations is trickier, because it was not true across the board that students from any particular group had a more negative experience in these conversations. You wouldn't be able to look at what box somebody checks and know how they're going to experience these conversations. People are more complicated than that, right? But for students whose rights were threatened by a specific policy, proposal, or discourse that was current at that moment, did find these conversations to be excruciatingly difficult. And you could imagine why, right? That if the effort is to recognize something about the other person that in some way includes their personhood and is not dependent on their political views, but you feel that their political views are about you, you experience it as a paradox to try to connect with them. And many students talked about this, right? So I had a queer student, who was very worried about what Trump would do to her marriage rights. And she said of the other students, she said, at the end of the night, we hugged. And I really needed that hug. But also I thought, I'm being hugged by people who don't want me to be happy. So these students both craved humanization, deeply wanted to be seen as human, and also it was deeply ambivalent, right? And this is a student who I interviewed close to the time that Trump had announced the Muslim ban on immigration. And she said, it's tough because they made the dialogue into games. And she's referring to these icebreakers at the beginning. It allowed for a lot of giggling and trying to have fun when it was a very serious issue for some people in the room. That was hard because there were all of these other emotions of, this is affecting me already. So it can be an incredibly isolating experience and alienating. Okay, so what do we do with all of this? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what all this could mean for our teaching, and then a little bit about what it could mean for our conversations. So first of all, there's no way to fix dialogue. There's no way to make it into a practice in which it's fine now, and if you do it right, then students are all going to have a great experience and no one's going to have any problems. So the most important thing to me is for us as educators to remain attentive to the way that students might experience these conversations as deeply alienating, and that there may not be ways to completely resolve that. So we need to remain attentive to it in our teaching and our role as educators. And there are ways that we can tinker with these conversations to try to make them more inclusive and supportive. And I'll talk about that a bit. So, one, co-create norms at the beginning. And you hear this a lot, but I suggest that we do this for reasons that are different than we usually assume. Often when you hear co-create norms, people literally laminate them and put them on the wall and refer back to them. I'm not suggesting that. We don't co-create norms so that we can have a speech code that we all need to refer to and follow, right? The reason I think it's helpful is because it gives students at the beginning a chance to get vulnerable about what they hope for and what they fear. And that in itself seems to set a tone. So when I say co-create norms, I usually start a semester with something like, we're going to be having some hard conversations about political issues. What do you hope for in these conversations? What do you want? What do you hope will happen? What are you worried will happen? What are you afraid of? If those things happen, what should we do? And what happens is students get vulnerable, realize they all have the same hopes and fears, and start workshopping together how to deal with it when problems arise. And so it sets a tone of personal vulnerability and a shared hope for what's going to happen. Actively practice listening. So this can also set a tone. So usually in my classes, we do listening exercises in which students literally practice listening to each other. And we do this in part because Miriam was in my class, so she knows. We do this in part because I think it actually helps to practice listening in the same way that it helps to practice public speaking, but in part to signal to students that this is something that matters in the class. So we'll do exercises where one student will talk to another for 2 minutes, and then the other student's only job is to listen and then try to repeat back what they heard and ask questions about it. That kind of simple exercise where students are signaled that listening matters. Third, encourage and model curiosity. So it can be extremely tempting as a professor, and sometimes this is called for and everyone makes their own choices, and that's a crucial part of what we do as faculty is make different discernments about this. But it can be extremely tempting to want to uphold a certain set of what one considers democratic ideals and shut down those that threaten them. And I'm sympathetic with this, and sometimes I think that is the right thing to do. But if, as faculty, we can model what it's like to stay calm and curious when a student says something that we personally disagree with, that can help our students respond in that way too. So when a student says something that one may think is politically, ethically wrong, it can be tempting to say, actually, no. Or to critically engage it, but in a way that one wouldn't if a student had said something that was politically and ethically right, in our opinion, right? Like we know what gets a pass, and we know what gets critically engaged, and students are very aware of this, right? And to instead be able to, for all students, when they say something that we agree with politically, by we I mean the professor, and when they say something that we don't, to try to really be attentive to saying, tell me more about that. Have you had any experiences that formed your thinking on that? What is it that you hope for about that? What is it that scares you about that? And try to really draw students out whether they agree with us or not. Get personal about politics. So you notice that a lot of my questions were personal. What scares you? What do you hope for? So when I say get personal, I mean beginning conversations with students' personal experiences, not ending there. So it's not that students can only talk from their personal experiences. It's that it's a good place to start. And then as the educator, we can connect their personal experiences to the larger issues that we're reading about and thinking about and talking about. But they can start there. And partly I suggest this because it's what is most true for the humans in our room. And partly because it lowers the bar to entering the conversation. For students who are like, well, I don't know anything about politics, so I'm just gonna, when they realize that they're talking about their personal experiences, they start opening up, they start engaging. Dig into disagreements. And so you heard me say during the part of this other section, now that might feel 100 years ago in the course of this talk, that it was when students understood the nature of their disagreements that they were most likely to recognize the other as having some ethical legitimacy, helping students to get there. Not in the first conversation necessarily, but at some point digging into what is it that we disagree about? Okay, well, everyone in here believes in the value of human life, right? We're good, we all believe in that, check. Why do we see this issue so differently? What is really at stake for us? And helping students to dig into that. Discuss next steps. And so this looks different if it's a class, but in dialogue programs, students tend to experience them as more meaningful if there's some kind of next action, even if that next action is something that they're going to do on their own in their lives. Like, what will you bring out of this into the world? Will you interact differently on social media? How? And then reflect on the purpose of the conversation. Because maybe it's obvious to you as the educator, it's never obvious to me, which is why I do this research. But it's definitely not obvious to students why they're spending all this time talking to each other when the world's on fire, right? Why talk to each other? So this isn't a lecture to give, it's a conversation to invite. Why are we doing this? So these are my recommendations. It's also important to put certain things in place before the dialogue begins and after it ends. So before it ends, when I say select for connection, not only diversity, it can be very tempting, particularly in a majority white setting like UVA, to try to create discussion groups that are maximally diverse. But what this can do, doesn't always do, but what it can do is benefit majority students at the expense of minoritized students. And this is because the majority students get to learn from diverse students, but it can end up letting the minoritized students feel even more isolated and alone. So when I interviewed students about their dialogue experience, some of the students who had the most difficult experience in the dialogue said, what helped the most was being able to look into so-and-so's eyes and know she understood. Feeling that the burden of articulation is not on your shoulders alone, and that someone else in the room who's in your discussion group understands, can help students feel more connected, less alienated. So this is why I think that's important, but understand what students' concerns are. So we don't need to make these judgments based on the way a student looks, right? We don't know what is important to students. It may be that their gender identity, which is not obvious, is actually what is at the core of their concern rather than their phenotype, right? So what can be helpful is to just give students an online poll at the beginning of the semester or before a dialogue starts that says something like, what aspects of your background and identity matter to you? You don't need to give a list. You don't need to set the categories for them. It can be, among other questions that might be helpful for you as the professor to know, what aspects of your background and identity or your experiences matter to you? And then finally, allow students to debrief with mentors. So students who had an especially difficult experience talked about debriefing with mentors as a way to interpret these experiences as empowering rather than only hard. What I usually do in my classes after a conversation in which I'm thinking like, oh, I don't know how that was for quite a few people, or even I don't know how that was for one person, I usually ask every student in the room to send me a 1-paragraph email. Miriam was in my class, so she knows. A 1-paragraph email. How did this conversation go for you today? That's all. It can be on your phone. It can be no capitals or punctuation. How did it go? And that allows me to know who I need to reach out to say, hey, would you like to come in and meet